Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement at Hyde Park United Methodist, and I've got a really special guest with me today.
Hey Matt, I'm Jim Harnish, and I have the joyful and challenging privilege of being the senior pastor at Hyde Park for 22 years, beginning in 1992.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a great time.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you're with us today, Jim. And you just preached a sermon where you kind of used the metaphor, or not even a metaphor, a poetic imagery of a thread, telling these key moments in the history of Hyde Park, how they led us to some of the big moments in your tenure at Hyde Park and what you hope they'll lead us to in the future. Can you tell us one or two of those key moments that maybe didn't make it into the sermon, but for you were like also markers along the way?
Yeah, of course. One of the lessons I learned at Hyde Park was that you have to shape your future out of your past. And that the deeper you dig into your past, you can find things that will guide and strengthen you for the future. You'll also find things for which Jesus said, let the dead bury their dead.
Yes.
But you'll also find the people, the stories that can help shape your future. Mm-hmm. And that was a new discovery for me. And as I listened to the stories, as I dug in, I found really what I believe was the thread, the heart, the long-time core of the faith in that congregation. And when we got in touch with that, it was, as the poet says, a thread that doesn't change when things change around it. And as long as you hold on to that thread, you can hold it steady. So yeah, that's one of the big learnings that I had early on.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key moments was that early when I came, I discovered a church that was very strong in knowing its past. This church had a great history and was pretty conflicted about who it was in the present and didn't have a clue about who God was calling it to be in the future. So we entered into a visioning process that took over 2 years with a team leading the congregation and really praying, studying, thinking through what it means to be a United Methodist church in this place, in this time. And out of that came the mission and core values that were adopted in 1994 and that have continued to be with us the whole way through. Yeah. So that beginning process was critical to everything that came after.
Well, and a testament to that, know who you are in the present, is when I came to interview for this staff in 2014, one of our former staff members, Emily Felgenhauer, through a friend, just got to me and said, when you go into that interview, here are the core values. Make sure you know these core values and make sure you know this mission statement of making God's love real, right? And it wasn't rote that I just recited those in the meeting. You know, I don't think that's why I got the job in the first place, but I think that those to me were linchpins for understanding more about who this community was and how I would fit into it, right? Especially that idea of being biblically rooted and Christ-centered. And before we started filming, you described yourself as a centrist evangelical, I think, right? Like evangelical, but not
in the old days.
In the old days, right? Lowercase e, right? Like not as a
not what it's
become today, right? But I think of myself when you guys described yourself as biblically rooted, I was like, yes, please. I want to be in a community that wants to take the Bible, and I heard you say this, or I heard someone say that you said this, take the Bible seriously, but not literally, right? I've been wrestling with that my whole life in different contexts that I've been in where the Bible was something taken literally or taken as a battering rod, right? Against people who weren't doing the right things or, you know, didn't meet the image of what people were looking for. And when I was coming in to do small groups, that idea of being able to be in a community that was Christ-centered and biblically rooted was just, boom, amazing for me. So knowing that you guys valued that was huge for me, aligning with this organization as well. And I think it's made a difference for people who come here today.
I think it's what some people are looking for.
Yeah.
There are people for whom this is not the right church.
Right.
They need to be in a very different setting. So praise God. Go. I used to say to the new member classes, if this is the church that is right for you, we're grateful for you and we'll do everything we can to help you grow. If you find that we are not the place you belong, I will help you find
Yes.
the congregation that matches who you are and what you need. I think that's a part of the broadly ecumenical spirit that Methodists have traditionally held. And it was, that's a transformational moment. And while I was there, and you may have been a part of this, every person we brought on to interview for the program staff, when we talked to them on the phone or whatever, we would say, okay, first, read the mission statement and the core values. It's found here. And go to the website and read the doctrinal statements of the United Methodist Church. And if that's where you are, let's move ahead.
Yeah.
If you read that stuff and it just doesn't fit who you are, then God will find another place for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So there was another part of your legacy that didn't get touched on in the sermon. I don't think it was also impactful when I came on to be a small groups director, and that's the discipleship pathway. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really important too. It began really with Bruce Tigert and I started a group that we called Fresh Start. And it was an invitation for people who just weren't sure where they were. It wasn't intended as a membership class, but more as help you find your way into following Christ. I think it was maybe 6 weeks or so. And we really had a good time with that. And then as we were working our way toward how do we live more deeply into our mission, we began to discover that we were doing a better job of getting members than we were doing of making disciples.
Yeah.
It was around that time that the General Conference approved Make Disciples of Jesus Christ for the Transformation of the World as the mission of the church.
Okay.
I cynically said, I'll bet Jesus is glad that we finally got around to that after all these years.
Yes.
But it fit who we were.
Yeah.
And we said, okay, what is it going to mean for us to make disciples of Jesus in the Methodist tradition in this community?
Good.
And that's where the whole vision for a discipleship pathway began. And there was a team of really great lay people. Rachel Burns worked really hard on that, who worked with us, with Justin. I forget how long it took. First, we had a 3-ring binder that we used in the new member class. And then that developed into the Disciples Path. And then the publishing house picked it up.
Yeah.
And it really hit the church at a moment when it needed. The last time I looked, something like 60,000 people had used Disciples Path.
Yeah. And so in the life of Hyde Park, if we continue that thread that we kind of, we kind of were talking about before your tenure here in some ways, and even Belinda's tenure of people finding us faithful into the future as we were doing all the building. Let's go into the 21st century a little bit and pull that thread. What did Disciples Path do for this church?
Great question. I'd say first, I think it did genuinely help people say, this is where I am on my journey of faith. This is going to be the next appropriate step for me to grow into being a disciple of Jesus. That it created that way for people to come on board. I think that's continued to influence the church. I think that's where the church needs to continue to be. I think the whole concern about the difference between being a member of the church and forming a disciple will continue to be critical. Back, even when the days I first got to Hyde Park, certainly while I was at St. Luke's, there were a lot of people in the community who were actually looking for a church. They thought they wanted a church. And they knew what kind of church they didn't want. They weren't sure what they wanted, but they were looking for a church. I don't think that exists much in the culture anymore. And so the challenge of connecting with people at the point of their spiritual hunger and need to draw them into a life of discipleship, of which the church is a key component, a key part. I love to tell the story. One day I got a call from an attorney who said, I'm not a member of your church, but can I come talk to you? And he named a member of the church who referred him to me because they were in a law practice together. He came in the door. I said, tell me about you. What can I do? He said, here's my question. Can I be a follower of Jesus like the church? I said, I think you could be a follower of Jesus without the church. I just think it would be much more difficult to do that. He said, well, where would I begin? And I said, well, have you ever read the Gospel of Mark? Not really. I said, okay, here's what you do. Do you have a Bible? I got him one. And I said, what should you start? I read the Gospel of Mark. Just read it like you'd read any story.
Yeah.
And if you get hooked on that, then go to Luke. And I said, there are 4 of them. No, he didn't know that. I said, well, then try Luke. And then let's get back together again.
Mm-hmm.
When we got back together, his eyes were bright, and he said, this Jesus is really something.
Yeah.
And he said, what would be next? I said, well, do you think you'd be interested in being in a group with a few other men who are professional people who are talking about their faith? And you'd be welcome to come and try it once, and if it works, fine. He's still in that group 10 years later.
Yeah.
And along the way, he went through major cancer surgery. I mean, major, up at Mayo, I think. And that group surrounded him, supporting him. And and now he's active in the life of the church. I love it. I think when we meet people where they are hungry,
Yeah.
we have something to offer. And in our tradition, I think we have something to offer in this culture, in contrast to all the rigid, dogmatic, often mean-spirited, right-wing politically leaning stuff that we get that seems so loud in the culture.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a little bit, about how people want to make a difference in the world. And not individualistically necessarily, not for personal recognition, but just we look at the world and we see the hurt. And the church is one of the best vehicles for still going and making a difference in the world. And I think if people can connect that to discipleship, not just to membership as something that we do so that one day we go to heaven when we die, but more so that right now, today, here and now, we can make a difference in the world. I think that can make the world a better place.
Yep. I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a great opportunity for people for whom the line that they've followed is the line that runs through Hyde Park.
Mm-hmm.
In the sermon, I quoted Bishop Lawrence McCleskey, who grew up here. And in his passage that I quote, he says, this church has never followed a narrow, self-interested path. He says it was tried, but it always failed.
Yeah.
He said this has always been a church of broad-mindedness, inviting a broad constituency. And he says this has been a church where love was the basic practice, not an exception. And I think because Hyde Park is who it has been, I think it is demonstrating that it can be a place where that happens for people today.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end. Jim, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week with another edition of Beyond the Sermon. Make sure you join us online or in person next week, by the way, because we're doing our big 125th celebration. We'll have one service at 10 a.m. At our Hyde Park location in Tampa, Florida, and online right here. So we look forward to seeing you. Thanks so much.